Well, welcome. I'm Russ Rapp, and we're going to be talking about non-duality yet again today. So my last live talk, I got into a discussion about why I make these videos in the first place, and kind of what I had come up with is I'm not really sure. But I think from me personally, it's one of those things where I talked a little bit about how as you go through life, seemingly, you have these moments of existential crisis where, you have that big, test the next day in school. And if you don't pass the test, your whole life's going to go askew and you're not going to get the job and you're not going to live the dream that you picture in your head because of this test. Or you want to get that job, or you want to fix something in your relationship, or if you get that new car, it's going to solve all your problems. Everyone's going to like you. And a lot of it is kind of the idea of an if-then statement, where if this happens, then this will happen. If I get this thing, I'm going to feel better. I'm going to feel happy. I'm going to feel at peace. My problems are going to be solved. There will be no problems if this happens. So if I become more non-dual, then I won't get angry. I won't have anxiety. And so that's kind of what I talked about last time. But then the analogy I'd come up with, I had forgotten to mention, is kind of the idea of if you were, picture yourself, you're the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, where the Tin Man is looking for his heart. But when Dorothy comes across the Tin Man, he's all stuck. He can't talk. He can't move because he's all rusted up. And so you put a little oil here and there to kind of loosen him up. And that's kind of how we oftentimes take an approach to life as far as oiling those specific areas that we have problems. And so if it's that big test that you're worried about, you try to get through that and deal with that issue. And then once that is solved, a lot of times you look back on it and say, well, why did I worry about that in the first place? Like, it wasn't as big of a deal as I once thought. Everything kind of works out as it should. And hindsight's always 20/20. But there's always all these if then, there's always all these I want to have this happen in order for everything to be okay. And so it's kind of like constantly oiling different parts of the Tin Man of your body. But eventually things start to lock up against, you're constantly having to lubricate your joints so you can work properly. And that's part of living. But essentially, if you take that same analogy, the main thing that the Tin Man is looking for is his heart. And so if you find the heart, then it's kind of like, if you think about it, and I know it's fictional, so it doesn't really make sense, but just imagine if the Tin Man found his heart, then he would circulate all the oil throughout his body, so then everything works as it should. And you don't need to constantly have to inject your joints with oil. And so getting to the heart of the matter, because it's the heart that matters more, according to the Counting Crows, finding that heart will make everything seem easier. So that's kind of an analogy as to why I like talking about non-duality. I know there's no point to it, but if you focus on the core issues, whether it's non-duality or something more core in any part of life, then everything else is put into place. It's kind of prioritized a little differently. It doesn't seem such an existential threat. And so finding the heart of the matter is key. And I think a lot of times, especially for spiritual seekers like yourself or like me, that are drawn to these subjects, I think a lot of times it's there's always another rabbit hole to go down. There's always another something to chase. And so the message of non-duality kind of gets to the core of the chase itself, of that seeking. And so, like Paul Hederman, I love how he says it, you just travel lighter. And so that's what appears or seems to happen in some cases. But whenever you talk about traveling lighter or becoming enlightened or finding peace or having some sort of non-dual experience, it becomes something that you have, that you experience. And non-duality isn't specifically about you or me. And so anytime the thinking gets focused on having something for yourself that maybe you didn't have before, as far as in time. So if I experienced this non-dual awareness, I want it to go on for eternity, for infinity, and now I'll be happy, I'll be at peace forever. And that's kind of the goal. That's what people are seeking when they come to non-duality. And well, if you have any idea of what it means, which means not to, that's kind of the simple way of saying it. But you come to seeking non-duality to have this infinite sense of peace, or non-attachment to oneness, all things, becoming everything, getting out of your limited self. And so when you come to non-duality in that sense, then you're constantly seeking for that experience. And that happens in time, because if you look back, which is a thought, when you look back into the past, it's a thought that your brain is producing in this moment. So it's not necessarily that your perception of the past is reality, because it's limited to your own perspective, but it's also colored with what's happening in the moment, what your feelings are, what your current thoughts are. And so you're not necessarily thinking about the past in a true sense, in a way that this is literally what happened. It's your perception in the moment, the way your brain is processing those memories. And the price of a memory is a memory of the sorrow it brings, which is another kind of gross quote. So when you're thinking in terms of time, it's, well, I want to somehow become non-dual. I want to achieve this state of this pinnacle, this peak experience, and have it last forever. So that's in time. And in space, if you think of space-time, it becomes this space here, what I perceive as, what I tangibly feel as me, Russ Rapp. That is something that I want to have for myself, for this entity, for this soul, for however you describe it, this being. I want to have this non-dual peace that I'm seeking. And so it's not necessarily a concern about everyone else. So you're not worried about your siblings or your significant other or your cat or your co-workers or whatever. That's not really your focus. The focus is all on oneself. And so that again is kind of a seeking for some sort of non-dual experience. And that kind of gets to the core of what I wanted to talk about today, is this idea of having to do something to become more non-dual, or to understand non-duality, versus this idea of not having to do anything, that is ever present, that it is and always will be true. And so that peace that is always there, that love that you can never be apart from, that's something that you don't have to work for. It's the idea of that you are forgiven, you are always loved. And so what happens in a lot of these discussions is the idea of having doing versus being becomes yet another duality. And so in a conceptual sense, non-duality is pointing to that and say, hey, your mind is seeing duality. Maybe that's not true, or maybe that's not ultimately what non-duality is talking about. And so a couple 3 weeks ago, I was looking, and you have a few people joining. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in live chat. But and thank you for listening. But a couple 3 weeks ago, most of my non-duality kind of research, I guess, for what I do, I think, seeing other people speak and how they communicate can kind of help me understand maybe some of the issues that people are going through or how people are communicating it. It's just like learning any sort of skill in life. I wasn't necessarily born an orator. I don't know if I'm really great. I watched a sermon this morning, and it was very good. And obviously it was written out, and there's a teleprompter and stuff, this is teleprompter free. But it's just spot on. It's just to the point, really connects. And, part of this free form version that a lot of non-dual speakers talk about, that's just, I think the idea of it is because you can't really fail. And in the moment, I think whatever arises is what maybe something that you can find benefit from. So a couple 3 weeks ago, I was just, since I do a lot of stuff on YouTube, I was like, well, let me just do a search online for non-duality, see what kind of things pop up, what websites are out there, because I don't I don't really know. So I came across one site, and I was kind of the focus of what I wanted to talk about today. The website is, I'm going to read this just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit of this duality of doing and being. But the website is deconstructingyourself.com. And I'm not necessarily endorsing the website or whatever, but I think it just kind of gives a description of non-duality from this perspective. So the question is, does a non-dual experience, and do you like it's my Enneagram pop socket? Yeah, that's how I roll. Does a non-dual experience require effort? And so I think that's a lot of the issues from what I've seen. When people talk about non-duality, it's like, well, what's the prescription? What do I do with this? And a lot of times people are like, well, you can't do anything. I've said that myself. Well, there's nothing to do. Non-duality is what is. And so there's nothing you can do. But from even this act of communication, it is in duality, it is in time. That's how we communicate. So it's, when you talk about non-duality in the absolute infinite sense, it doesn't make sense to people. And that's how it is. But we're always seeking for some sort of something we can do. And so there's this divide where, there's moments where let me just read this and we'll get into it. So does a non-dual experience require effort? Another big controversy concerns what a person has to do to have an experience of non-duality. Because from a spiritual viewpoint, non-dual awareness underlies everything and is always already there at the base of all experience. It's possible to state that absolutely nothing need be done to experience it. It's already there and you're already experiencing it. You just have to notice it. This is the effortless model. So a lot of times I talk about the effortless model, but you can't have one without the other. That was my add in there. A second way of looking at it is the effort model, which says that while, yes, non-dual awareness underlies everything, there are a lot of layers of belief, psychological blockages, and simple ignorance getting in the way of seeing this experience. The purpose of meditation and other practices is not to create awakening, but to remove what is blocking the experience of the non-dual awareness that is already there. Even if you're already even if you've already had a strong non-dual experience, the deepening of your awakening requires more effort. Proponents of the effortless model say that even making an effort at all is just putting more blockages in the way of seeing the non-duality that is already there. The very act of meditating to get something, they say, is paradoxically just one more thing that is getting in the way of direct perception of ultimate reality. And this is the last section I'll read. Proponents of the effort model say that very often people who pursue the effortless path don't have a very deep awakening. They see the effortless model as being more about developing a concept of non-duality, i.e. being able to talk about it, and being very concerned with the language around it, rather than developing actual depth of non-dual experience. So that's, I think a lot of times that's the angle. I'm very much a thinker, and so I come to non-duality in a conceptual sense, and I think that's where a lot of people fall short, is because they're trying to understand non-duality. But the proponents of the effortless model say that things like meditation are a way of getting in the way of non-duality, and that interpretation I think I would maybe reframe in the sense that it's not that trying to meditate or have these experience of unblocked reality or clear moments or unfiltered reality, doing things to achieve that isn't necessarily getting in the way of non-duality. It's just yet another thing that seems to be happening. And so that's where, from an effortless standpoint, the idea of non-duality is there's nothing you can do to screw it up. There's nothing you can do to ultimately separate yourself from reality, from what is. And the proponents of the effort model say that if you don't do these types of practices, or if you don't clear out your own BS, you'll never experience a non-dual state of experience. And I think I've heard other people say something similar, but I think how I would describe it is, when it comes to non-duality, it's not so much that you're going to clear out all your blockages. Now you're going to be perfectly attuned, because if you think about it from like a chakra standpoint, or even just an energy flow, like the idea that things become blocked in your body, like if you have tight muscles, or you have a thought process that everything kind of pools around, you kind of have this repetitive thinking, that in a sense is kind of a blockage. It's not allowing things to flow. And so if you want to have something separate, you create that dam. So like if you have a river running through, a river of energy, you set up the dam, and that essentially is a blockage, and it creates something behind it. So like as we create ourselves, we create these blockages. And so I think you can kind of talk about the idea of, blockages is a sense. I mean, I think there needs to be some definition of terms when it comes to the idea of blockages, because whether it's beneficial or not beneficial, but when it comes to the idea of somehow getting rid of all these blockages, yet again, it's all about you. It's all about something that you can do. But I think in those moments where you're still functioning as the separate self, the fool, you have these moments of like, so I've described this in other videos, but this idea that just out of nowhere, it's not like I was meditating, there's this sense of peace, like where everything is as it should be and always will be okay, or at peace. And And that's not necessarily from doing anything. It's just like everything, all the BS that you kind of believe about yourself kind of falls away. And in those moments, it's really clear as to the reality of existence. But I think in the same in that same moment, you could also say, this is how it is and how it's always been. And so when you have let's say a non-dual experience, if you want to describe it like that, there's this sense of, I don't know if you want to call it mundaneness, but this idea that everything is as it's always been. And that's kind of the cosmic joke, is you try to find this pinnacle of non-dual awareness where you're constantly at peace and you're this inner bliss of love. And it's this, that's it. And so you're still going to be a fool. Things are still going to happen or seem to happen in your life. But we see it as reality from a separate self and other. But in the act of speaking and listening, which is a duality, that is essentially what seems to continue to happen. And so, in a sense, like I'm talking to a camera here. I'm just letting my thoughts flow from myself, and without a real dialogue, I mean, you're going to eventually be watching this video, but there's really no, I'm essentially talking to myself, even though we have some viewers, which I appreciate, but ultimately we are talking to ourselves because we're always projecting onto life. And that's where I think what I wanted to talk about today as well is anytime there seems to be a separation, I think there is that's a key or clue, an opening to question your beliefs. Because non-duality isn't a belief system. I mean, it means not to. So if you see separation, and I think in today's climate, in this world, it's even more apparent, this idea of separation, when you have to stay so far apart, and we're interacting with others a lot more in the digital world online. I think it's easy to communicate with others in a different way. And so I think there's a duality of my 3D, my real world, my face-to-face self. So the person that I go out to work, I go to the store, that's the person, that is this way. And then I go online and that's a different person. And so my online self is kind of this character that I create, or let's say I'm, nowadays people seem to be at odds with one another. So a lot more people are willing to communicate in a different way online versus in person. And so there's this idea that if I'm online and I am interacting with people that maybe I don't even know who they are. I've never met them. They're just a name on a screen, or, someone commented, I get a lot of comments in my videos. So I don't necessarily know these people, but if I do approach that from a perspective that I'm online, it's a different realm, I can act in a different way. I can be, I'm not going to be scared to offend people. I'm going to, if someone upsets me, I'm going to go on offensive. I'm going to attack them, or I'm going to, be negative, be mean, because it's online, so I'm never going to see this person, or even in our interactions with others, people that we know online, on social media, we're more willing to give our opinion, to talk, to make assumptions, to project our own BS onto others. And so I think looking at the separation of your 3D character and your online character, that is yet another duality. And so it's easy to dehumanize other people online and make that separation, because you would never act like that in person, let's say. But that's just yet another division within ourselves, another um, wall that we create to divide ourselves internally and with others. So there's all of that all over the place, because partially that's kind of how the brain works to create meaning, is by objectifying, essentially. But I think if you objectify your internal world, I think that's part of what meditation does, is you see yourself objectively. And so you see your thoughts not as identify with your thoughts, but you see them as something that appears to be happening. And so the witness becomes a witness of the thought. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear. We got about 10 more minutes. I'd like to hear what you have questions about, or if you have any comments, because that's part of the reason why I want to do live chats, is because it's a lot more rewarding, I think, for me to be able to directly find those pain points for people, and areas where maybe there's a misunderstanding, or things that people are struggling with, because ultimately that's the freedom of non-duality, is really questioning your perceptions, and so your beliefs. And so that's where, especially online, where everyone has an opinion about everything. And my dad used to always say, opinions are for a-holes. Everyone has one. But everyone seems to have an opinion these days, but no one's willing to really listen to anyone else, because they're so identified with the thoughts or the beliefs that they have. And so they're not willing to listen to any other opinions or any other ideas. And so everyone gets kind of puts on the blinders and isn't open to other ideas. And so, if you don't have a dog in the fight, you're a lot more willing to open yourself up. And I think that's where a lot of people, other speakers, talk about this idea of expansion versus contraction. And ultimately, that's kind of the only seeming function that happens, where if you hear a piece of news or a piece of information and you use that as a way to be open to question, to be open to other viewpoints, that can open you up to other perspectives. But if you use that to kind of close your mind, that's a sense of contraction that can take place. But whether you do it or not, I guess, it's up to you. But we do have a comment. Brandon says, "It feels like to me when I get non-duality, the seeking stops. Is that something you could speak about, if you agree or disagree, etc.?" Okay, so I'll read that one more time. Brandon says, "It feels like to me when I get non-duality, the seeking stops. Is that something you could speak about, if you agree or disagree, etc.?" So this is where I should meditate for 30 minutes to be able to have a real deep, answer to your question. But I guess I would agree in the sense that I think there's another duality that people run into, is this idea of epiphany, or getting something, understanding this. There are moments where it's just like, oh, I get it, and then that seems to go away. And in those moments of getting it, in that moment of peace, I think there is, like I said before, there's a recognition that even when there is a sense of not getting, it doesn't really matter, because let's say you're on a bus and you're sitting next to a guy or a gal, and you have this moment of non-duality where you get it, and you know in that moment that whether or not their thought process gets it, they get it because they are what is. Their experience may be completely different than yours, and so it, whether or not the seeking stops, it doesn't change anything. Mangesh says non-duality is about physical or non-physical. Non-duality is about physical or non-physical. This physical world is made of atoms, and non-physical world by consciousness. So that's where one of the things, from self-inquiry that kind of along these lines that I've considered is this idea: to what extent does my intellectual understanding of quantum physics, which is pretty minimal, how has that shaped my belief in this idea of nothingness? And I don't have a great answer for that, but it's something that maybe you can sit with and consider. Because if you look at quantum physics, you get into an atom and you get into quarks and all that, and ultimately it's either, waves. It's the whole idea of the wave particle theory, where everything is a wave, everything is not formed, but then if you put your attention on something, it becomes particle. So our attention creates solidity, essentially. And so I think the idea of being a separate self is the idea of believing that there is something solid, there is something fixed, and ultimately there is nothing fixed. I think that's part of the message is, even in this moment with me sitting here with whatever atoms that are a part of what I consider myself, even though I seem to be sitting fairly still, I'm moving, but I'm on an earth that's spinning, which is just an idea. I mean, obviously science can help prove some of the physical aspects, but moving through space at, all these insane speeds, there's nothing really still. And it's really like if you're riding in a car, you seem to be sitting still in the car, but the car is going 70 miles an hour, or, whatever, 90 kilometers. Is that right? 95. But you're going down the road, you seem to be still, but you're in a car that's moving really fast, and it's only until you crash or you run into something that you realize the speed that you were going. And so a lot of our understanding is very relational. It's it's all relativism, kind of that understanding of duality. But ultimately, non-duality is, I would say, maybe about both physical and non-physical. This gets into what I was talking about earlier with the effortless model of trying to conceptualize everything. Because anytime we talk about consciousness, we really have to focus on what those terms mean, because consciousness is there's a lot of connotations. It's really something that people have put a lot of meaning into that may be different than others. So, like, unless you really clearly define the terms of what you're saying when in regards to consciousness, you could be saying something and people are like, "Well, I disagree with you," and the only thing you're really disagreeing on is how you're defining the word consciousness. And so, a lot of non-dual speakers say the same thing, or they say it in different ways, and they're meaning the same thing, but people will disagree because of the word choice. So. Brandon says, right on. Thanks for the talk and sharing your perspective. It's appreciated. Well, thank you, Brandon. I love your questions. We got about, about a minute left. So any final thoughts? That would be great. And then I did have, let's see. I had someone send me a link to a Krishnamurti video. I'll probably check that out soon. I've seen some of uh, his talks, but I don't have a lot of background in Advaita Vedanta. It's really I don't know how you define what I talk about, but we're all talking about the same thing in a different way. So thanks for your perspective. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Like I said, there's certain things that maybe you'll connect with that'll add benefit from an effort model type of a thing. But ultimately, whether you get it or not, whether your life seemingly improves or not, you're always connected to what is and the love and forgiveness that comes with it. So until next time, peace.